Hello and namaste everyone. Today we are going to talk about the interior of skull. The anatomy of the interior of skull can be studied by dividing the interior into two parts, which are the interior of the cranial vault, that is seen over here, and the base of the skull. So we begin with the interior aspect of the cranial vault. Here, this is the anterior part of the cranial vault, whereas this is the posterior part of the cranial vault. The lining of the cranial vault is by endocranium. Frontal crest or prominent bony ridge is present anteriorly in the midline. It is the site of attachment for falx cerebri, which is one of the dural folds. In the midline, a groove known as sagittal sulcus is running from the anterior to posterior aspect, which is responsible for lodging the superior sagittal sinus, one of the dural venous sinus. On either side of the sulcus, we can see the presence of granular pits, which are also known as fovea, which indicate the location of arachnoid granulations, which are the structures which absorb CSF into the dural venous sinus. We can remember this by a simple mnemonic which says A for arachnoid granulation and A for absorption of CSF. On either side of sagittal sulcus, we can see parietal foramina as well. Here in this specimen, only one side bears the parietal foramina. Various other markings are evident as well, which are produced due to the presence of cerebral lobes and blood vessels. On the interior of the parietal bone, vascular marking of middle meningeal vessels is especially pronounced. Now we are going to talk about the interior of the base of the skull. It is divided into three easily recognizable cranial fossae, which are called the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa, which are arranged in three levels like steps of a staircase. Each fossa contains different parts of the brain. Now let's talk about the anterior cranial fossa in detail. Anterior cranial fossa, it is the most superior of the three cranial fossae. It is formed by contribution from three bones, that is the orbital part of frontal bone, cribriform plate and crista galli of ethmoid bone, and the lesser wing of sphenoid bone. The anterior cranial fossa is situated superior to the orbital and the nasal cavities. The floor of the anterior cranial fossa is at the level of superior margin of the orbit. Frontal lobe of the cerebrum, along with the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract, rest on the floor of anterior cranial fossa. The boundary between the anterior and middle cranial fossae is formed by sharp posterior edge of lesser wing of sphenoid on lateral aspects and anterior margins of sulcus chiasmaticus on the central aspect. The orbital part of frontal bone is the major contributor of the anterior cranial fossa, and it forms the roof of orbital cavity. The orbital surface of frontal lobe of cerebrum lies over this part. Medially, the frontal bone forms the roof of ethmoidal sinus and articulates with the cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone. In the midline, along the anterior wall of the fossa, a prominent bony ridge previously mentioned, known as frontal crest, is present. It is the site of attachment of falx cerebri, one of the dural fold present in median longitudinal fissure. The horizontal bony structure known as cribriform plate of ethmoid bone is present centrally on the floor of anterior cranial fossa. In Latin, cribriform basically means pierced with small openings, as in a sieve. This part of ethmoid bone, the cribriform plate, forms the roof of nasal cavity as well. The cribriform plate supports the olfactory bulb and has numerous, around 15 to 20 small openings, which are known as olfactory foramina, which are traversed by the first cranial nerve, that is the olfactory nerve fibers running from the nasal cavity to olfactory bulb. Cribriform plate is the thinnest part of base of the skull, and it may fracture during trauma involving the face, leading to anosmia, that is the loss of smell, and or CSF rhinorrhea if the trauma is accompanied by meningeal tear. On the either side of cribriform plate, a couple of foramina known as anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramina are present in the ethmoidal bone, which transmit the neurovascular structure of the same name. The anterior ethmoidal foramina also forms the border between the anterior and posterior ethmoidal air cells. Anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries are the branches of ophthalmic artery. The anterior ethmoidal artery, these arteries supply the dura mater of anterior cranial fossa, the ethmoidal sinus, lateral wall of nasal cavity, nasal septum, and frontal sinus. Anterior ethmoidal artery can be a source of nasal bleeding or epistaxis, as it is one of the component of Kisselbach's plexus present on the antero-inferior aspect of nasal septum. Anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves are branches of the nasociliary nerve, which itself is a branch of ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. These nerves are responsible for providing sensory innervation to the dura mater of anterior cranial fossa, lateral wall of nasal cavity, nasal septum, skin of the external nose, and sphenoid sinus. On the anterior aspect of the cribriform plate, central part of ethmoid also features a triangular projection known as crista galli, which in Latin means the crest of a rooster. It is the site of attachment of the dura mater fold known as falx cerebri. On the immediate anterior aspect of the crista galli, or in between the crista galli and frontal crest, we can find a blind ending foramen, which is known as foramen cecum. In less than 1.5% of the individuals, this foramen transmits nasal emissary vein, which connects nasal cavity to superior sagittal sinus, thus allowing spread of infection from nasal cavity to intracranial sites. The anterior portion of the body of sphenoid, along with the lesser wing, also contribute in forming anterior cranial fossa, as mentioned previously. The anterior part of the body of sphenoid, which is known as jugum sphenoidal, is located behind the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone and in front of sulcus chiasmaticus. The posterior margin of the lesser wing is related to a sinus called sphenoparietal sinus. At the medial end of the posterior margin of lesser wing of sphenoid, a projection known as anterior clinoid process is present bilaterally. Anterior end of free margin of tentorium cerebelli, another dural fold which separates cerebrum from cerebellum, is attached to the anterior clinoid process. So, this was a brief description of the interior of cranial vault and anterior cranial fossa. Thank you for watching.